Now, I'd like to welcome to the show Kurt Couchman, Senior Fellow at Americans for Prosperity and author of the recent study, The Bidenflation Blame Game: How Big Spending Politicians Scapegoat Business. Welcome to Free the Economy, Kurt.
Thanks for having me, Richard. It's great to see you.
So, the past couple of years, we've seen rising consumer prices across the board. So, your new study points out that prices have gone up 20% in just the last 3 years. A family of four now needs to spend over $11,000 more than they did in 2020, 2021, just to maintain the same standard of living. So the big question is, are we experiencing these higher prices because corporations suddenly got greedier in the last few years?
No, I mean, corporations are always in the business of profit maximizing. That hasn't changed in the last couple of years. What has changed there's been a massive flood of fiscal and monetary stimulus to the economy. I say stimulus in air quotes because a lot of what it's done is stimulated inflation and distortions, and it hasn't really been a helpful thing for most people. It's been a sugar high that's being followed by a sugar crash.
So putting aside your argument about how they've sort of misdiagnosed the problem, how would the greedflation fighters in the Democratic Party think their solution would work? Because they're saying all of these higher prices we've been seeing in recent years is because corporations have been really greedy and they're gouging you and they're trying to like pull more money out of your wallet. And so presumably they have some solution to that. But is that just federal price controls for everything in the economy? Or are they just going to say prices can only increase 2.7% and not more? How would that work?
Yeah, that's a lot of it. There are a number of price control bills. Senator Bob Casey, for a Democrat from Pennsylvania, who is the chief architect of the greedflation argument, which, by the way, economists at the White House were telling the Biden administration not to embrace 2 years ago. Ultimately, they got overruled. But Senator Bob Casey, he has a number of pieces of legislation. They are all premised on price controls or having bureaucrats harass businesses that do the things that seem unfair to the regulators. So one example of that is he has the Shrinkflation Prevention Act, and that would empower the Federal Trade Commission, the Attorney General of the United States, and states attorneys general to investigate companies that have reduced their product sizes without commensurately reducing the prices on those products. So it's, you create this inflation with the government spending and borrowing too much, and the Federal Reserve accommodating all that. And then you empower bureaucrats to harass the businesses that are just dealing with or trying to deal with the ripple effects from all of that loose fiscal and monetary policy.
Well, so you've got, say, Nabisco makes a box of crackers that's 12 ounces, and then their costs go up. So they say, you know what, we're not going to raise the price on the box, but we're going to have 11.5 ounces of crackers instead. Then presumably they would get investigated by, Senator Casey's FTC shrinkflation cops. But what if they just raise their price? Or
Well,
they going to
apparently that wouldn't
they're
apply
also
to
going to get
the
investigated for price gouging?
Apparently, there's other legislation for that. I mean, these folks are nothing if not relentless in trying to cover all of the possible bases. You know, the old joke with antitrust law is if your prices are too high, you're gouging. If they're too low, you're flooding the market. And if they are similar to your competitors, then you are obviously colluding. So there's really no way you can win under the activist antitrust methodology. But yeah, I mean, Senator Casey and some of his friends in the Senate that have embraced this kind of messaging, including Senators Tammy Baldwin from Wisconsin, Sherrod Brown from Ohio, Catherine Cortez Masto from Nevada, and then also some that aren't up for election this year, including Senator Bernie Sanders, Senator Elizabeth Warren, Senator Sheldon Whitehouse. Between them, they have a variety of pieces of legislation to try to legislate prices and profits and the business strategy of major businesses that are much more competent to figure out what their customers need than a couple of folks in DC.
So, it seems that among other things that we need to kind of restate the difference between monetary inflation, which is the real definition, and the resulting rise in retail prices throughout the economy, which is the result of that. So there's a great Milton Friedman quote, and I thought about this even before I saw it in your paper, but it's in the paper too. That he famously said that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. It's a result of too much money, of a more rapid increase in the quantity of money than of output. Why do we never hear that definition in news reports about rising prices? Why is inflation is always described as the rise in consumer prices, not the actual thing it really is, which is the government's increase in the money supply?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I guess you'd want to talk to somebody who studies journalism and the way that the incentives in that business are shaped. I mean, I think part of it comes down to the way that the kids are taught in school. My 13-year-old in seventh grade just last year was learning about the Great Depression. And I said, okay, what are they teaching you? And she's like, oh, this, that, and the other thing. And I'm like, well, those are all symptoms, but the real causes of the Great Depression were the Federal Reserve letting the money supply shrink by a third, the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, and then a couple other things. The persistent experimentation, and she's like, oh, they didn't really talk about all that. And I'm like, I don't know why, but they should. And maybe it's because to really get it, you need to have a pretty decent understanding of economics, like the economics of money, banking, and finance. Like that is all foundational to these things. So it's difficult. But maybe for your listeners, I'm sure you've already done this on this program already at some point, but it might be good to refresh exactly how this latest episode of inflation kicked off. Congress borrowed and spent massive amounts of money before the pandemic, and then when the pandemic got going, they did some more of that, and then finally, when Democrats had obtained control of all three parts of the policy-making apparatus of the federal government, the House, the Senate, and the White House, they passed the American Rescue Plan Act, which was a $1.9 trillion spending bill, which spent out very quickly, even though more Keynesian but responsible economists were saying that the output gap was only $420 billion. So this is more than four times as much as the so-called output gap. And they warned, I mean, Jason Furman and Larry Summers, Democrats who had served in the Obama administration, they said that this was going to create inflation. And in fact, they were right, because when you create that much more new debt, Treasury has to go auction that off and raise it from the capital markets. The Federal Reserve uh, can and did purchase Treasury debt, not directly from the Treasury. They don't do that, but they bought the Treasury. They have an auction process that they use to buy Treasury debt in the secondaries market. But that created more space for the rest of the market actors to backfill with Treasuries. And so, in fact, over the course of the pandemic, the Federal Reserve more than doubled its holdings of U.S. Treasury debt from about $4 trillion to over $8 trillion. Some of that was necessary to counteract the reduction in money turning over in the economy, the monetary velocity, but they went way too big. And then Congress had created so much debt that the Federal Reserve still hasn't been able to get back to normal. They're still 70 something percent above what they were before the pandemic. And they're stuck in a world where, because the market is pretty saturated for US Treasury debt, the Federal Reserve is stuck between a bad choice of higher interest rates and higher inflation. And it's not clear they're going to be able to get out of that unless and until Congress gets the spending and debt under control, which we're hopeful that they'll do next year and going forward.
So, one chart from your study I think really stood out to me was corporate profits over time. So if you look at that measured as a share of the total economy, which is sort of the way it makes most sense to measure it, they've been remarkably stable since the end, certainly the end of the Great Recession. So on the chart you see between 2010 and 2023, they've sort of barely budged much above or below 10% of GDP. Um, so do the people who are insisting on corporate greed as the cause of rising prices have any sort of rebuttal or explanation for that? That actually corporate profits haven't been gobbling up this giant share of the economy after all?
Right. No, they don't have a good response to that. So Senator Casey in his report claims that corporate profits grew by 74% between July 2020 and July 2022. And as our mutual friend Alex Narasta recently tweeted, if you're starting anything in the second quarter of 2020, then you can be safely ignored. And so that's what he does. Um, but he doesn't even, so he cherry picks the dates, but then he also uh, uses a measure that isn't actually corporate profits. It doesn't include the adjustments for inventory valuation, which is the smallest of three factors. The big one is capital consumption. It's the amount of investment you need to do just to counteract depreciation so you're not falling behind. That's a huge chunk. And then also federal taxes. That's not money that's flowing to shareholders and employees. That's just going to the government. Once you adjust for those things, then you see that corporate profits have just risen with the economy. And we've talked to a number of reporters, and we've done social media, and neither Senator Casey nor his friends at the Groundwork Collaborative and elsewhere have had any kind of response. They're just kind of ignoring it and hoping that will go away and that they'll be able to just win by flooding the airwaves. And so we think that's really inappropriate and to not even respond to the rebuttal, but we're going to keep making the point and we'll see what they do in response.
Well, yeah, I mean, it also seems a little bit like there's a parallel to social welfare policy where a lot of people on the left side of the political spectrum who would always want to see more poverty reduction measures from the federal government, more social welfare spending, um, take these time series and say, oh, look, well, over this period of time, poverty's hardly gone down at all, or the the monetary kind of income inflows to people in the bottom of the income ladder haven't increased that much. And then you say, wait, but are you counting tax policy and the earned income tax credit? Are you counting the increases we've already actually seen in real life in social welfare spending? And they say, oh no, we're just looking at cash incomes. So there was, people said 50 years ago, we need more social welfare spending because people are poor. They got dramatically more social welfare spending and people are significantly less poor. But the people who want yet more spending aren't acknowledging any of that. So it seems, it's not an exact parallel, but it seems like you can do a sort of lies, damn lies, and statistics version of this with any of these, even if you're not cherry picking a highly anomalous economic time like the second quarter of 2020.
Right. Yeah, and I think you're onto something that there's narrative building, and that's the objective. And we talk about motivated reasoning, the idea of fitting your facts to fit, selecting your facts and cultivating the assessment of them to fit the narrative that you've already planned out. And I guess what they found is that in polling, the idea that corporations are behind it all does pretty well, but it's just not true. And those of us who think that truth matters and facts matter have an obligation to call it out and say, no, this is actually what happened. And it is interesting that the people that are, by and large, most loudly using the greedflation narrative and trying to blame corporations are those who also most enthusiastically supported all of the spending and the debt that brought us into this situation. So it does seem like they are building a narrative that is specifically designed to distract from and confuse people so that they don't connect the dots and see that it was these specific individuals that did the things that ultimately led to inflation, higher interest rates, housing crisis that we're experiencing now, and are setting us up for much, much worse in the future. I mean, if you think the last couple of years of inflation have been bad, just wait until we have a debt crisis, because then the Federal Reserve will really be the lender of last resort to the federal government. And you can bet the money supply is going to expand dramatically. And we might not have just, 9-ish% inflation. We could have double digit or even worse inflation in that scenario. All bets are off because we don't know how that would unfold.
Yeah, we may have to lure Javier Milei from Argentina to the United States, deal with our future hyperinflation.
That's
Um,
right. Isn't it an amazing thing that we're being inspired by an Argentine politician these days?
uh, so your point about sort of like building this narrative that's not really based on much fact, um, I think sort of shows that like this isn't just sort of a lazy way of shifting blame. It's maybe almost a necessary way of shifting blame. If you're someone who supported the policies that actually created the problems we're dealing with now, you might think it's absolutely a necessity in terms of uh, your future politics and political success to provide this alternate explanation, as weak as it is, right? Because of course, we have, you mentioned Bernie Sanders, he's been blaming corporations for everything bad about America for 50 years. So that's not new. And there are plenty of people on the sort of, left left edge of the Democratic Party who are willing to say corporations are bad for everything, but they're even more painted themselves into a corner now, it seems like, because they've been so promoting this $1 trillion here, $1 trillion there, $1 trillion for everything solution, that they have to come up with a scapegoat. Otherwise, they are the problem, and they would don't want to admit that.
Right, and this is directly linked to their policy goals. If they were to honestly recognize that the spending and the debt, and I mean, over the course of the pandemic, there was an extra $6 trillion of debt and spending that was created to deal with that. Almost 2 trillion of that was an overlap between pandemic spending and Biden administration spending, much of which the Biden administration spending was not really pandemic related, the infrastructure, the so-called Inflation Reduction Act and beyond. But if they were to have to make the case for some of the policies they're trying to pursue against the broad-based tax increases that would take to fund it, or the broad-based spending cuts that would be required to offset this new spending, then it would make it so much harder for them to pursue the activist agenda that they're looking for. Um, and so it's one of those things where denying the truth helps them sustain, I guess, the hope and the possibility of transforming the role of the federal government into something that's even more of a cradle to grave system that they're striving for, even though it's not really the proper purpose of government and wouldn't be good for us in terms of the outcomes we get from it.
Well, yeah, it definitely seems like if, you know, people who are people in Congress who want more sort of endless trillions of dollars in spending, uh, they certainly can't do it the responsible way, right? Because there's not enough federal budget to cut to get an extra $6 trillion out of it. Um, and but and so you have this kind of two-level problem, it seems like, and keeping going down that path would make both sides of it more, which is that it's kind of a 1-2 punch, and a lot of times they get talked about separately, but we're kind of putting them in context here, which is, first, you've got this biggest burst of government deficit spending in the history of the world over the last few years, and that creates a spike in inflation, which we're talking about. The increase in the monetary supply is the inflation. But then the second half is that the Federal Reserve now feels it's necessary to dramatically increase interest rates over a short period of time, um, which creates other problems for, American households looking to finance major purchases, like cars and homes. So, um, I wonder, how long will we be dealing with the fallout of just what we've seen so far, even if we hopefully don't see higher spiraling uh, spending like we've seen the past few years in the future. If we sort of somehow kind of ease our way back to what we might consider normality, what's the prospect going forward?
Well, we've already made good progress toward that. The spending binge that happened over the last couple of years effectively ended, or at least new stuff, when unified government ended at the end of the last Congress. So with Republicans narrowly retaking the House, it hasn't been all sunshine and roses as we've seen, but it's turned off the extra spending spigot. And as that's happened, inflation has come down because there hasn't been as much money flowing into the economy, or at least new money. The Federal Reserve has started to normalize. They still have a long ways to go. I've seen some articles talking about how, oh, the money supply is shrinking, which hasn't happened since the beginning of the Great Depression. And that's true, but it's a totally different scenario. During the Great Depression, they actually needed to keep it stable or growing slightly to accommodate the economy. But here there was so much monetary expansion driven by the new spending and debt that Congress had approved and the presidents had signed, that we actually needed to bring down the money supply growth to squeeze the inflation out of the system. There was still enough sloshing around that there was room to tighten. So the other part of the Milton Friedman quote that you left off was that it's money supply in relation to economic growth. And the money supply has actually grown dramatically and it's been shrinking the last couple of years. Real economic growth, the real production of goods and services in the economy has been growing, but sluggishly, not nearly as fast as it should be. So if we can grow the economy faster while the Federal Reserve is continuing to normalize, then we can get through this, quicker than if we have a slow economy and the money supply remains high. So in other words, if we can return to growth and prosperity and kind of bounce back the rest of the way, then that's a lot better of a world than stagflation.
Well, yeah, as you pointed out, the with Republicans nominally in control of the House for now, slightly in control, um, that we haven't had uh, huge increases in more authorized spending, in the past year or so. But I feel like there's historically this situation where even if you sort of stop spending from growing as much as it has in the past, there's a sort of ratchet effect in the federal government wherein record high spending in one Congress is treated like the new normal in the next, and that it's sort of hard to go back. Um, so I wonder, can we ever decide? So not only is this sort of the difference between some people talked about stopping inflation, like slowing the rate of growth in inflation versus stopping it immediately versus actually like lowering prices potentially in the economy. I mean, can we ever decide that it's like 1945 again? World War II is over. The
Mhm.
existential crisis is done. We don't need to spend uh, a record high percentage to the economy every single year forever. Um, can we like bend the budget curve down, or is the best to hope for that we just don't get the Inflation Reduction Act passed every year forever?
Yeah, we can fix this. It is a very different scenario than right after World War II. Then demographics were very favorable to rapid economic growth. Now we've got a lot of people who are retired, living longer. That's a beautiful thing. But it means that we don't have the positive demographics for labor supply going forward. In addition, World War II was a massive crisis, a massive mobilization, and then the need for it was over. So we could just kind of turn on a dime, and we did, and then we actually experienced amazing growth despite, or maybe because of reducing the government borrowing. But now, so much of the spending component comes from federal health and pension programs. I know a lot of politicians don't like to talk about it, but Social Security spending is growing quickly, well beyond its projected revenues. It's already starting to dip into the trust fund and has for a while. Medicare and Medicaid are incredibly expensive. The good news is that there are a lot of different options for addressing them, and our friends at a whole bunch of different organizations have developed specific ideas about how to get a hold of those things, drive efficiencies so that we're reducing costs for taxpayers while also improving the program access and quality for beneficiaries, and probably making life a lot better for healthcare providers by reducing the bureaucracy of it all. But what we don't have is a budget system for Congress to actually make these decisions in a politically sustainable way. So that's a lot of what our focus here is in terms of budget process reform. What are the things that Congress could do so that it has the ability to make the tough but necessary decisions while the members, the marginal members whose votes you're going to need to get it done, will feel like they can make those decisions, do what needs to be done, and actually survive politically because they don't feel like they can right now under the current system.
Well, that's a good question about how the process of making these decisions can lead to better decisions, which I feel like is something that kind of gets left out of this debate sometimes. But we might need those reforms soon because we are going to be having some expiring tax provisions from the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. And we are likely to, run up against a fiscal cliff, as they call it, in terms of crunch time for making some of these hard decisions. So what can we expect from that?
The fiscal cliff is coming. It's happening in 2025. There's a huge amount of tax provisions that expire at the end of the year. The debt limit, of course, comes back at the beginning of the year. The suspension of the debt limit expires on January 1st, and then there are what's called extraordinary measures. So ultimately, sometime between probably April and August, Congress will actually have to make a decision on that. That's probably too soon to overhaul the federal budget process. If there's a Republican trifecta, then we expect there to be a reconciliation bill that could be quite substantial, and the pieces are coming together on that. If there's one or a series of bipartisan deals, then that's a very different animal. And that's actually where fixing the process would have much more space, because the rules of reconciliation don't really give you the ability to change the process. Things have to have a direct fiscal impact, and a lot of the procedural things don't. But beyond next Congress, one of the most powerful things Congress could do to budget well would be to actually do a budget. People talk about the budget resolution or appropriations or reconciliation as the budget. None of those are a budget. A budget is one bill that has all the spending, what we call discretionary and mandatory, or if you prefer, appropriations and direct spending, and all revenue, including ideally all tax preferences, all the credits, deductions, exclusions, exemptions, all that stuff together. So you can see this is what the federal government is doing, and this is where they get the resources to finance all of that. How can we do better? And how can we empower the committees to manage the portfolio of programs within their jurisdiction, but within some limits that are set up by the budget resolution? So the idea is to have a budget act, a budget bill that is set up by the budget resolution to empower the authorizing committees, the appropriations committee, the budget committees, and leadership and rank and file members to manage all this stuff together and contribute their ideas and actually have more of a bottom-up process where all the members can get their ideas in front of their colleagues and see what people like and learn from that and move on to the next thing. And we just don't have that right now. Appropriations are a quarter of spending and none of the revenue. So that is the most fundamental piece of what Congress can do to fix the way that it does budgeting. And it's the popular appropriated programs like defense and veterans and infrastructure and healthcare and stuff that would give members the political cover to chip away at the problems elsewhere in the budget, whether they're from screwed up tax policy or social security imbalances or whatever else. The whole thing altogether is what gives them the ability to do what needs to be done and survive.
Yeah, your point about how all these other ways of funding the government aren't a budget. Oh, that I don't know how long it's been since we've had Congress that actually passed all their budget bills on time and did things according to what is supposedly, theoretically, the process. I know I just interviewed recently Scott Hodge from the Tax Foundation, and there's an old quote that he and I both like about tax reform, and that is former Secretary of the Treasury once said, "At the very least, we should have a tax system that looks like it was designed on purpose." And I feel maybe the budget system should be like that as well, where it might not be perfect, but it should at least look like we're doing it on purpose, not that we're sort of like kind of crazily lurching from one emergency deadline to the other.
That is so right. I mean, right now, the way that Congress does policy that adds up to budgeting, sort of, is they'll consider things in different pieces. Like the Legislative Branch Appropriations Act actually failed in the House last week narrowly. That is 1/10 of 1% of federal spending next year. Why are they spending any significant time on that separately? Like it should be part of the overall thing. And there's so many times where something will come up and enough members will be like, that seems like a good thing to do, but it's out of context of like the trade-offs and like what you have to give up to get it. And so there's all this stuff that sounds good enough that ends up getting enacted, which means that we just have a lot more bloat than we should. Programs aren't coordinated. Jim McGovern, who's a Democrat from Massachusetts, was talking a couple years ago about how there's all these nutrition programs scattered across the congressional committees, and we really should have something that looks at everything holistically. And so I would submit to the gentleman from Massachusetts that this is a way, and this would make an awful lot more sense. And in fact, that's something pretty close to what the state of Massachusetts does.
Well, yeah, I mean, you look like a bad guy if you vote against the like childhood nutrition bill, even if there's already 11 other childhood nutrition policies that aren't being administered well. So like, oh well, I don't want my opponent to put an ad on TV that says I'm against childhood nutrition, so let's just vote for this one thing, out of context of everything else that's already been enacted.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And but when you have it all together, you can say, oh, we do have 160 housing programs. We don't need to create a new one. In fact, maybe we can take these seven and make it into one, and these two we can take, and we actually don't need those because they're duplicative of whatever else is going on. And so you don't need to take let's say that we have 160 and the ideal is four. You don't need to do that in one fell swoop. You can do a couple this year, a couple next year, and as different challenges come up facing the federal government and the American people as a whole, you can sort of shape things, do a little bit this year, do a little bit more next year, check, adjust, make sure that what you did last time makes sense, and then if it didn't, then you reverse course and do something different. But right now, it's like once you do something, it's almost like it's locked in for all time to come. And it's like a Herculean effort to change even little things. Like, do you remember there was an issue coming out of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act a few years ago about the tax treatment of church parking lots? And that was a huge issue to resolve. It was stupid. Like, it's not a big deal. Just like if you had a budget with everything in it, you just come back the next year, you have a vote on it in finance and ways and means, and then it's done. So
Oh
yeah, it
man.
doesn't make a lot of sense the way things happen right now, but people are so used to this dysfunctional system that's been here since they came to Congress, and they just figure that's the way that it must be. And so we've talked to a lot of people about this concept. Legislation's been introduced. Blake Moore from Utah and Marie Gluesenkamp Perez from Washington, a bipartisan duo. They have a bill called the Comprehensive Congressional Budget Act, and it's picking up some steam, but we really need to get Congress overall to reach critical mass and realize that that's a much better thing to do for all of them and for the American people.
All right. Sounds good. Well, Kurt, your bold proposal to solve the deficit by taxing church parking lots, I think will get a lot of attention. Um, but seriously, everyone should actually be looking forward to fiscal cliff and making sure we get policies that will see us through and hopefully contribute to future growth in the future going forward.
Absolutely.
Um, so before we go, uh, thanks for being with us. Before we go, would you like to tease out where do we find you? Where do we follow your stuff? What website should we go to? Where what we should like and retweet all the tweets from where?
Absolutely. So I'm on Twitter, or I'm sorry, X, and I'm easy to find at Kurt Couchman, KurtCouchman. That's where I'm most active in the social media realm. Everything that I write goes up on our website, americansforprosperity.org. We are a nationwide grassroots organization, so we have a presence in all 50 states. You can find your state's Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, all sorts of materials out there. I've been playing around a little bit with creating a YouTube channel. Not a whole lot up there yet, but I'm building it out. And actually, the conversation we've had today about where does inflation come from and where does it not come from, that's on deck for the next pair of videos that I'll be creating for that.
That's great. And the AFP has the Bidenomics website, right?
Oh, that's right. Yes. You can go to Bidenomics.com and find out more about the nature of President Biden's policies and those of his friends in Congress and why they're not serving the American people, and then also some real solutions, not only in budget, which is where I spend most of my time, but also in energy and labor and lots of other things as well, so that we can really kickstart things and let everybody have the space to pursue their version of their American dream.
All right, excellent. Thanks for being with us, Kurt.
Thanks for having me, Richard.